mention that this forum is really an opportunity to open minds, learn from one another. What Brendan presents tonight may not be the views of the UVM Medical Center. We've had confusion about that in the past. We are not currently offering herbal medicine at the UVM Medical Center. I don't want to confuse people. And I do want to let people know that this is a chance to learn from other providers who aren't currently working at the UVM Medical Center. So from there, I'd love to just introduce Brendan. Hopefully many of you already know him. Brendan is an acupuncturist and an herbalist. He's the owner of Jade Mountain Wellness and the author of The Yin and Yang of Climate Crisis. And he is gonna share with us a wonderful presentation. So I'm gonna turn it over to you now, Brendan, and we'll mute myself and turn my video off. But please feel free to ask me questions in the chat box if you have any.
Great. Well, thank you, Kara, and everyone at UVM for sponsoring this. It is funny how things work out. I think the talk was scheduled to be pretty well attended in person, and since it went online, it seems like even more people have been able to attend online. So it is funny how things work out. And so thank you all for attending. My name is Brendan Kelly. I'm actually speaking to you from our Chinese medicine clinic here in Burlington, Vermont. We are open, we are treating patients, we are providing acupuncture and herbs, herbal medicine, and we're really happy to do so in these times of uncertainty. And I do wanna hopefully have time at the end to speak to you about what's going on in terms of the virus, because I think it ties in very directly with the rest of the content. You know, there is a saying in Taoism, a blessing in Taoism, that says, may you live in interesting times. These are very interesting times. So the good thing about interesting times is it really can be an encouragement for us to examine our lives and examine the world around us and examine the institutions we have around us. So even with the disruption, even with the potential scariness of what's going on, I really do think that what we're all experiencing now individually and collectively really is an opportunity. It doesn't mean it's an easy opportunity, and it can be a scary opportunity and a disorienting opportunity, but it really, really is an opportunity. And just as I think the virus is an opportunity, I certainly think climate change is another opportunity. Because things like climate change and things like the epidemic, the pandemic, that we're experiencing from a Chinese medical view, both of those things, both of those kinds of things happen for reasons. And so I think Chinese medicine is very, very well suited to examine that and to really look not only about what's going on, but I think even more importantly, the underlying root issues of why things are going on. So the imagery that's used in Chinese medicine are roots and branches. The branches are the symptoms. The branches could be the symptoms like climate change or an epidemic or a pandemic. The roots are where those issues are coming from. So Chinese medicine is really set up historically to talk about both the branches, which are the symptoms, as well as the roots where the symptoms are coming from. So I do hope that we'll be able to talk at the end about a Chinese medical understanding of what's happening both in terms of climate, but also in terms of the epidemic, the pandemic. So this is obviously a picture of the yin-yang symbol, a very, very important idea in Chinese medicine. Really is quite literally a prehistoric understanding. It is an understanding that really quite literally predates modern human history. And it's a very, very old idea, and it's one that's very, very relevant today. So, and not only in terms of our well-being, self-care, the care for the climate, as well as what's happening with the epidemic, with the pandemic. So a couple of things about the yin-yang circle is it is not neatly divided in half. So it's not that one side is white and one side is black. There's a implication of movement within the image. And if you look at the top of the yin-yang circle, the white part, that white part, as it reaches its peak. And so what I mean by that is as it reaches its highest point, where it's as the widest it's going to be. As the white reaches its peak, the black begins to appear. And the white is yang, and the black is yin. If you look at the bottom of the circle, it's the same thing. As the black reaches its peak, as the black reaches the part where it is its widest, the white begins to appear. So that's very, very important, because what that means visually is that when something reaches full expression, when something fully expresses itself, it transforms. And so what that means on the top of the circle, when the yang, when the white part reaches its peak, the yin begins to appear. On the bottom, when the black part, which is the yin, reaches its peak, the white part begins to appear. And also, one of the obvious other visual parts of the yin yang circle is within the white there is the black, within the black there is the white. So that means within the yang there is the yin, within the yin there is the yang. So that's also important, because Chinese medicine is really very much a non-dualistic view. It's not a view about right and wrong and good and bad. It's about how things move and how things are interrelated. So this is not only important in talking about self-care, but it's also really important to talk about social issues, environmental issues, and ultimately with what's going on with the virus. So yin yang symbol talks about movement and about change, about how one thing becomes something else. And it also talks about how within something, there is something else. Chinese medicine historically also is really old. And for me, that is a source of real encouragement, because what's happening now in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the epidemic, while it is obviously happening currently, and it is a real significant issue globally, it is not a new thing. Chinese medicine has been treating epidemics and pandemics for a long, long time. And the good news about that is there is a specific Chinese medical tradition called the School of Heat that was created to literally treat epidemics and pandemics. And it was really codified or really written about starting in the 1300s. And by the 1500s, it had been really well developed and was written about even more. So the length of time that Chinese medicine has been practicing really provides a context for ideas that can work and ideas that maybe don't work so well. So the good news about what's going on now is that people in China, people around the world historically, have been dealing with similar questions, like the question of what is self-care? What is ecological sustainability? What does an epidemic or a pandemic mean? What does an epidemic or a pandemic mean about our health, the health of our communities, and really the health of the planet? Really, really important, because what can happen in a moment of crisis, which I think we are in, is we can really limit the scope, I think, of what we're talking about and what we're looking at. But I think it's important to actually open up that scope and to try to provide some context for what's going on outside of our own immediate situation. Chinese medicine is also a medicine that comes from an agrarian culture. So what that means is Chinese medicine is literally coming from a culture that is close to the land. It's coming from a culture that was raising animals and growing medicinal plants and growing food. So that's literally the reference point. For those of us who are interested in self-care and ecological sustainability, Chinese medicine has been asking those same basic questions for thousands and thousands of years. And the reference point is nature. The language that we use in nature comes from the seasons and from the weather. So when we talk about self-care, when we talk about ecological issues, when we talk about something like an epidemic or a pandemic, we use words like hot and cold and damp and dry and wind. And so we're not using similar language to Western medicine. Now, there definitely can be overlaps. There's ways that we can translate East and West, but the language that's used in Chinese medicine in many cases is different than the language of Western medicine. And the orientation of Chinese medicine is towards nature. And that connection to nature is fundamental. That is quite literally where the medicine came from. And for those of us practicing and studying Chinese medicine now, it's really the roots. It's really how the medicine makes sense and the overall orientation of the medicine. And another really important point is Chinese medicine assumes connection. Western medicine I think, is working in that direction as well. Western medicine is talking about the body-mind connection, which is a really great, important thing. And Chinese medicine never lost that connection. That interconnection of the body and the mind and the emotions is quite literally embedded in the medicine from the beginning. So the good news about that is for those of us looking to have our medical system here in the West progress, there are existing models, there are existing maps internally that allow us to see the specific connection between our body and our mind and our emotions. And I would also extend that out even more to allow us to see how what's happening within us is a direct reflection of what's happening in the world around us. So the title of the talk today is Self-Care in the Climate Crisis. And that's a very relevant perspective, in my opinion, because what we're going to talk about is the direct connection between what's happening within us internally and what's happening in the environment and the culture around us. So again, that's baked into the medicine from the beginning. That's embedded in the medicine quite literally from its origin for several thousand years. So those of us looking to have a more holistic, interconnected view of the world, Chinese medicine is a very well developed existing model that can provide us that. And in addition to being holistic, Chinese medicine really, in its essence, is holographic. And so what I mean by that is that the assumption in Chinese medicine is that the little picture and the big picture are in fact the same picture. And that's very important because that allows us to see patterns. That allows us to see how what's happening within us is reflected in nature. That's what's happening within us is reflected in our culture. What's happening within us is reflected in what's happening with the people and the cultures around us. So even more so than being holistic, it's holographic. And so what I mean by holographic is a hologram is a Western created image. It's a laser computer generated image. And if what you're looking at, the image on the screen now, if it were a hologram, if you broke off a corner of that physical 3D hologram, it would have the entire image of the rest of the hologram. And so that is a fundamental assumption of Chinese medicine, that to understand the big picture, you can understand the little picture. And to understand the little picture, you can understand the big picture. So that again is embedded in the medicine from the beginning. The very first Chinese medicine book that we still have in print now, called the Neijing, in the first chapter, it says all of the influences in the universe are within us. So that's not even saying all the influences in nature. That's saying all of the influences in the universe are within us. And then it goes on to say, imply that we are small universes unto ourselves. Very, very significant. And that's not just nice theory. That's not just nice philosophy, though it is nice philosophy in my opinion. That is a fundamental view of Chinese medicine and of Asian, East Asian thought. So that allows us to have the reference point, I think, to understand how self-care and climate change are intimately interconnected. And Chinese medicine also historically is very interested in what it calls a differential diagnosis. Western medicine is also interested in that. Chinese medicine's version of that is that, as I was mentioning before, we have roots and branches. The branches are the symptoms, and the roots are where the symptoms are coming from. So it's not enough from a Chinese medical view to know that the planet is warming. It's not enough even to know that we have an epidemic or a pandemic. That's part of it. That's very, very relevant. But what we're trying to understand is, why did those things show up? Why do we have climate change? Why do we have epidemics and pandemics? And also in terms of our own well-being, in terms of a differential diagnosis, to differentiate the different kinds of self-care that will be appropriate. Because not all self-care is necessarily appropriate for everyone individually, and not all self-care is relevant to us collectively. So what I really want to talk about is a Chinese medicine informed understanding of self-care now in the context of climate change, and within the context, I think, of the social assumptions that I believe have created the underlying issues of climate change. So differential diagnosis, very, very important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So a little more about yin and yang. Yin is the descending part of the circle, as is on the screen. Yin is water. Yin is cold and cooling. Yin is night and winter. Yin is latency. Very important idea. Very important idea in terms of our health now, in terms of epidemics and pandemics, and also in terms of climate change and self-care. Yin is rest and relaxation. Yin is contraction. Yin is old, and yin is less. So let's just look at those last four parts of that: the rest, the contraction, the old, and the less that is yin. Usually when I give this talk in person, I can rely on your feedback and your comments, but I'll just have to do that myself. So those last four things are fundamental to health and well-being in Chinese medicine. And as I see it, those are not things we value in our culture. We don't value rest, we don't value contraction, we don't value old, and we don't value less. In fact, we have whole medical systems, not medical systems, whole cultural systems that are based on not valuing those things. Our economy, for example, we're led to believe that our economy, or the global economy, is healthy by definition if it is expanding. And that is simply not true, and it's also simply not possible. Things will expand and things will contract. And also, let's make it a little personal. Do we all individually value old? Do we value old things? Do we value old ideas? Do we value old remedies? Do we value old people? And my answer to that is no. In many cases, we do not. And we also have a cultural belief, which is connected to our economic belief, that if we have more stuff, we'll be happier. And sometimes people do need more stuff. There's lots of people who need more stuff. People who need more healthcare, more education, more clothing, more care, more compassion. It's not that more is better, but we're led to believe if we have more new stuff, we'll be happier. And it's simply not true. And in Chinese medicine, even a basic understanding of Chinese medicine can make that clear why that's the case. So getting back to the idea of latency, which is in the middle of that description, part of what is happening now, I think in terms of our health and what's happening ecologically, is that we've lost latency. So latency is a Chinese medicine idea that we can have imbalances, personal imbalances, cultural imbalances, ecological imbalances. We can have different imbalances, but it doesn't present itself. Or to use a more Western term, we can have imbalances, but they're subclinical. What's happened, because we have lost yin individually, collectively, ecologically, because we have lost yin, the things that have been out of balance for a long time are expressing themselves. And so one way to look at climate change now is all of the effects from the greenhouse gases we've been emitting since industrialization in the middle of the 1700s, the consequences of those are coming to fruition. That the consequences of those emissions are really starting to show up. So the good part about that is we're getting to see the consequences of our actions. The difficult part of that, or the potentially difficult part of that, is that those consequences are really, really serious and really, really severe and really, really systemic ecologically. So we'll get back to this idea more later, but part of what I think we need to do is to create latency. So in ecological thinking now, in terms of climate change groups, they talk about resiliency, and I think that's a really good idea. And what I'm proposing is yin resiliency. So what yin resiliency means, we have the internal capacity, the sense of relaxation, the sense of peace that we can deal with imbalances. When we lose that, then things really start to get out of balance often quickly. So yin is a really important fundamental idea in Chinese medicine in general, and is really, really important now. So what balances yin is yang. So yang goes up, yin goes down, yang goes up. So yin is fire, yin is warming, yin is summer and day, yin is expression, yin is activity, expansion, new, and more. So let's look at those four again. Do we value those things in our culture? Yes, we do. We value activity, expansion, more and new. And there's not that those things are bad. I'm not anti those things. I'm just saying we overvalue those things to the point where it's not only creating individual problems, but it's creating ecological and social problems at all. So one way to summarize that is we have a yang excess culture. We have a culture that values activity over resting, expansion over contraction, new over old, and more over less. And not only is that the case, but it's embedded in our cultural systems. We have entire systems, our economic system being one of them, but we're going to go through other systems very clearly with that. This imbalance is not only embedded, it's structural. These imbalances are how we have set things up. So if we're going to address the bigger and deeper issues we have ecologically, medically, socially, culturally, I think it's urgently important that we look at where those imbalances are coming from. And a very basic understanding of yin and yang, I believe, can show us quickly where these imbalances are coming from. In other words, where these root issues are coming from. So another image of yin and yang, yin creates yang creates yin. They're not oppositional. Sometimes in the West, we think about yin and yang are fighting or yin and yang are oppositional. I don't think that that's what Chinese medicine means historically or what Chinese medicine is talking about. Yin becomes yang becomes yin, the white becomes the black, and the black becomes the white. So a natural flow of things is one thing becomes the next thing. And then within the yang, there is the yin, and within the yin, there is the yang. So now let's take what I think are these wonderful philosophies and take it really out of the realm of Chinese medicine in the treatment room and really take it to the larger scale, take it to the larger climate reality. Because Chinese medicine, as I mentioned before, is really set up for this. It's a medicine that has this big view and that is set up philosophically to understand how what happens in the treatment room or happens in our own lives is a direct reflection of what's happening in nature and vice versa. So let's take these theories, these ideas, and now start applying it to the larger scale. So a little bit about climate history, climate change history. It's not a new thing. It dates back to the 1890s, the research, not the 1990s. So there is really no serious scientific discussion that I can see about the reality of climate change. The only discussion is how quickly it could get bad and how catastrophically bad it could get. But this guy, whose name I believe is Svante Arrhenius, that's not a language, a perspective I can pronounce that well, but he's now called the father of climate change, and he modeled by hand in the 1890s without supercomputers, without even calculators, the basic dynamic of how an increase in greenhouse gases warms the planet. So we've had an understanding of climate change. We just have chosen to not look at it and to not do much about it. So the basic Western science of climate change is really simple, that sunlight comes in, it hits the ground, it's reflected back out. When there is an atmosphere like we have on the planet, some of the warmth is kept in. As greenhouse gases are released, more of the refracted, radiant energy is kept in the climate. And it's called the greenhouse effect because that's very similar to how the greenhouse works. So this is really high school science. The basics of it is high school science. It's really baffling to me how some folks are presenting this as being unclear science, or the science is out. The science is not out. This is really, really clear. But now, if you want to get into the more complicated stuff, which I go into in some detail in my book, you can. But the basic science is the more gases there are, the more sunlight is held into the atmosphere, and the more the planet warms. So the basics of climate science is pretty straightforward. So what's happening now, to kind of shift from the science to the politics or to other parts of climate change, is that greenhouse gases are increasing. And we've known that. And as we're going to talk about shortly, the United States disproportionately releases a huge amount of greenhouse gases. So the planet is warming, due to the increase of greenhouse gases. It's pretty, and there's lots of different dynamics about what's going on, but that is part of the real basic, simple science of it. And so as the warming is going up, what has been more clearly understood in the last 15, 20 years or so is as the warming is going up, the planet's ability to cool itself is going down. So this is very important because it's not just a one-sided thing, or it's not just one side of the dynamic, there's two sides of the dynamic. The heat is going up as the planet's ability to cool itself is going down, which is why, in my opinion, that's one way to explain why the rates of increase of warming are happening, starting to happen exponentially, or could be happening exponentially, because it's not just a linear thing. It's not just one thing is going up. One thing is going up, and the other part, the cooling part, is going down. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So some of the issues that are affecting or creating the dynamic where, along with the increasing greenhouse emission rates, we're having the planet's ability to cool itself down going down, includes deforestation. So the numbers about deforestation are really staggering. We talk about wanting to save the Amazon, which would be a really great and noble thing to do, but we really should start at home in terms of deforestation for those of us in the United States. By most estimates, we have deforested at least 95% of the original forests that were here when settlers showed up from Europe several hundred years ago. And many people think it's 97 or 98%. So we don't have much moral authority, really, to go around the world and claim that we know that people should stop cutting down the forest. They should stop cutting down the forest. I hope they do stop cutting down the forest. But we should practice what we preach. And the rates of deforestation in the United States are really still pretty staggering. And it's what's happening in the United States is happening around the world. So part of the numbers, in about the last 20 years, 720 million acres of forest have been cut. That's really staggering. That's about the size in 20 years of the size of California and Texas combined. Really, really extraordinary. So what is the result of that? Well, forests by their nature sequester greenhouse gases. They hold greenhouse gases, they pull greenhouse gases into the trees and the plants, pull it into themselves, and they hold it there, or they sequester it into the ground. So with less forests, that means that the planet's ability to sequester greenhouse gases is going down. So as emissions are going up, the rates of deforestation is resulting in a lack of coolant internally. So deforestation is a very significant issue. Disease is a very significant issue. I write about this in some detail in my book. I was living in Montana about a decade ago, and the idea that disease was happening was very, very real because you could go hiking and biking and skiing and you could see it. Whole mountainsides would be died off, very much like this picture, especially up high in where I was in Bozeman, Montana. So the reason for this, one of the main reasons for this, is that there is a pine beetle, a mountain pine beetle, that is not being killed off because the winters are less cold. And so the population of the mountain pine beetle is really increasing. And what they do is because that's what they do, it's not their fault, they're just being pine beetles, is they bore underneath the bark of the pine trees and they can girdle it. And so once the girdling occurs, then the tree can't survive and it dies. And so this is really at epidemic levels. You can go to Montana, to Bozeman, to other places, and you can see it for miles and miles and miles of these once thriving forests. They're just dead. And they're not even dying, they're already dead. So the scale of this is really extraordinary. In about the last 10 years, 70,000 square miles, not acres, in 10 years, 70,000 square miles of forest just in the United States and Canada have died. That's about the size of the state of Washington. So it's really extraordinary. And if you want to see it, just go to the Rocky Mountains, to Colorado and Montana and Idaho and other places, and you'll see it. You'll see it all over. So as with deforestation, the loss of the forest, the loss of the trees is reducing the planet's ability to sequester greenhouse gases. That means as the emissions are going up, the cooling ability of the planet is going down. Another part of it is the loss of coolant on a planet scale is ocean acidification. As amazing as this may seem, we may have literally filled the oceans to capacity. We may have filled the oceans to the extent that they can no longer hold on to the greenhouse gases we've been emitting. A very well-known climate scientist, James Hansen, has estimated in his book, which I cite in my book, that up to 90%, 90% of the greenhouse gases that we've been emitting since industrialization may be held in the oceans. So think about that. We've released so much waste, so much warming gases that the oceans have taken them in, and now we've filled up the oceans. That's really significant. That's a whole lot of stuff that we've been releasing. And so what appears to be happening now in the Arctic, especially in the Arctic Ocean, around the Siberian Peninsula, is that what was once held in place is being released. And so what climatologists and oceanographers are seeing now and describing in some detail now is that there's methane blooms that are coming from the ocean floor and making it all the way to the surface and being released. And that can be 2 or 3 miles. There's so much methane being released from the ocean floor that it's coming all the way to the surface and being released. And those methane blooms are up to 1 kilometer wide, which is 1/2 mile wide. So that's a tremendous amount of methane being released, and that's significant because methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. Depending on who you talk to and what researchers cite, it's between 20 and 100 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, for example. So what does this mean? It means that the oceans, which were cooling, which were yin, which are huge accumulations of water, that cooling effect is being lost. Really significant. Just as with deforestation, just as with the death of the forests, we know emissions are increasing. The planet's ability to hold the emissions and latency has gone down. If it seems like it's a similar story, it's because it's a similar story. We have a pattern. Melting permafrost, the pattern continues. What was once permanently frozen is not permanently frozen. Right? There's an image in the lower right-hand corner of the slide with a little guy in boots and a rain jacket. And above him is what used to be once permanently frozen, permanently frosted. And so the rate of loss of permafrost is extraordinary. It's happening all over the planet. And what happens as a result of that, similar to what we've just been talking about, is multifaceted. The first part is that when the permafrost melts, the sunlight which was coming in and hitting the permafrost, that would be reflected into the atmosphere, that sunlight is coming in and hitting the water and the soil and warming up the planet. So that has a net warming effect. But another big part of it is that underneath the permafrost, there was a lot of anaerobic decomposition happening for hundreds and quite literally thousands of years. So anaerobic decomposition happens when there's things, plants, animals, etc., that are breaking down without the presence of oxygen. And so that decomposition creates methane. And so there's huge amounts of methane being released from what was underneath the permafrost. So what is that? That's loss of latency. The stuff that was there globally that we weren't experiencing the results, the effects of, are now being released. And latency comes from yin. So one way to understand this is the planet is losing its yin, and I believe, which I'll talk about briefly, the reason that the planet is losing its yin is because we've lost our yin. We've become too busy, too excited, too overstimulated, too focused on the outside world, and less focused on our own internal condition. So the pattern continues. So what does this mean? How can we relate deforestation, loss of forest from disease, loss of permafrost, and the acidification of the ocean? What's the pattern? Chinese medicine excels at seeing patterns. And so what we can do is we can take climate science and we can overlay Chinese medicine on top of that science, and we can really see the patterns that emerge. So as the climate science is very clearly stating, the ability of the planet to cool itself has gone down. So the way we can understand that in Chinese medicine is the cooling capacity is the yin. So the planet's ability to cool itself has gone down as the planet's temperature has gone up. So yin is going down and yang is going up. Well, the good news about that is that's a particular diagnosis in Chinese medicine. And that diagnosis is called Yin Deficient Heat. So let's break down the term. First part, yin. Yin is coolant. Deficient is lacking. So there's heat, which is overstimulation and hot, things warming up. That heat is coming with a lack of coolant. So the good news about that is in Chinese medicine, if we have a diagnosis, a differential diagnosis, where we've differentiated the kind of condition that's going on, if we have a differential diagnosis, we can treat it, whether it's in the treatment room or the scale of the culture or the scale of the climate. So this diagnosis, I think, is of real importance, not only ecologically, but also in terms of us. Because guess what one of the most common diagnoses we treat at our clinic? Yin deficient heat. And so that is not a coincidence. It's not that the planet is warming and we're warming internally. There's a specific correlation between that we're going to talk about. So Western science explains what I consider more branch issues, and Chinese medicine looks at the root causes. So this can be an example where the East and West really can meet. I think climate science is very important, is essential at this point. And I think the insights that Chinese medicine can provide is also very important. So this can be an example where Eastern, we've talked about integrated medicine or integrating different views of the world. This can be an example where Eastern and Western can really not only complement each other, but really create something that's bigger than either of them. So I think this looking at branch issues of climate science and Chinese medicine issues of where the symptoms are coming from is a really important blending of East and West. So where is this warming coming from? Well, disproportionately from us. The United States is approximately 5% of the global population, and we create approximately 20% of the greenhouse gases. It's been a little more, it's been a little less than 20%. I think it's a little less now, but actually not that long ago, it was a little more than 20%. So it's approximately 20%. So we have an obligation to really own up to that. We're 5% of the population, we create 20% of the greenhouse gases. And now some people will say, well, we need to create those greenhouse gases to maintain our lifestyle and our quality of life. And in my opinion, that's absolutely untrue, because there are many, many countries who have much higher quality of life, who create much less emissions. For example, Scandinavian countries, they create a fraction of the greenhouse gases that we create, but they have a much higher quality of life. Many European countries, Germany, France, they again create 50 to 70% less emissions per person, but they have a much higher quality of life. So this is not the disproportionate rate between our population globally and our rates of emission. That's not our quality of life, that's just waste. That's just inefficiency. That's just not really owning up to the effects that we're having on the planet. So one place to start with climate change is here in the United States. So big question. We have climate science, we have Chinese medicine theory. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where we're 5% of the population, we create 20% of the greenhouse gases? And in a larger sense, what are the underlying assumptions that have created the societal institutions that have created climate change? So these questions are really important in my opinion. And I give these talks in different places. Some people say, yeah, that's all relevant and important, but we have to address climate change. Like, it's a crisis. So this other kind of stuff, this other theory is maybe not so important. This theory is of essential importance, because when you have a crisis, it's of vital importance from a Chinese medical view that you understand where the crisis is coming from. If we really want to understand and address climate change, we have to understand, in my view, where it's all coming from. We need to treat the roots as well as the branches. For example, you have a bunch of tomato plants, and the tomato plants are dying. and they're wilting and the tomatoes don't look good and the leaves are turning brown. One way to address that is to try to do some things to help the branches and the stems and the leaves and the tomatoes. But maybe what you need to do is just water the plant. That if the plant got water, if you got a 5-gallon bucket and went out and watered your tomato plants, maybe the rest of the tomato plant would look fine. So I think it's of vital importance, urgent importance, that we look at where all of this is coming from. So let's look at the big picture now. We've looked at the big ecological picture. Let's look at our big cultural picture and see if we can see patterns. So economically, is our economy healthy if it's growing? Not necessarily, right? But the basic economic assumptions, the basic economic theory we have in the West and in the US is in order for the economy to be healthy, it has to be growing. That is a particular orientation. And on a finite planet with an economy that uses actual finite things to create products, at some point you cannot keep growing forever. You don't have to have a PhD in Chinese medicine or a PhD in economics to understand that. Nothing can grow forever when it's in balance. Eventually the expansion leads to the contraction. Also, question economically, is continuous growth desirable? Not only is it possible, is it desirable? The story that we're led to believe is true is yes. The economy is growing continuously, that's desirable. What is that saying? We want more yellow. We're not interested in contraction, we're only interested in expansion. And is recession and depression undesirable? Now, I don't ask that question flippantly. When I was writing my book, we were just coming out of the recession that happened with the in 2008, 2009. And I know that people in Vermont and around the country were very much affected by that. And I know that there's people in Vermont and in New England and around the country that are being affected by what's happening now. But a real basic reality is that things expand and things contract. If we have set up a system, now talking about our economic system, where it's only healthy with continuous expansion, that is not possible. We have to realize that things expand and contract. So what does this speak to? This speaks to our orientation towards yang. And a lot of our other beliefs speak to the same orientation. So let's take it medically, which is what I do a lot of the day, a lot of the week, is working in our clinic. So let's not only take this theoretically, let's take it right now. Let's take this to self-care, and let's take this to what's going on with the epidemic and the pandemic that now confronts us. Do we believe in old remedies or new remedies? One thing that's being discussed now is, well, from a Western biomedical view, we don't know how to treat this virus because it's a new virus. That's one view. From a Chinese view, Chinese medicine has been treating all kinds of infections, viral infections, bacterial infections, etc., literally continuously and effectively for several thousand years. So we don't have to know, from a Chinese medical view again, the specifics of a virus. We have to understand the nature of the virus. For example, we can understand that a virus is cold or hot, the bacterial infection is cold or hot, then that orients us how we can treat it. So, I've been asked this, what do I think, how do I think that this can be treated? Well, I'm very, very confident that what's happening now in Vermont, in the US, globally, can be treated by the old. It can be treated based on these traditions that date back hundreds and even thousands of years. Do we support new research or old research? Now, I'm not anti-new procedures, I'm not anti-new research. But sometimes we're led to believe that something is better simply because it's new, right? And are there valuable new things? Yes, there are valuable new things. But something is not inherently better simply because it's new. We have to be more discerning about that. We have to really evaluate whether something that is new is actually better than something that's old. Because in Chinese medicine, historically, what was valued was the old. That perspectives, herb formulas, treatment views in acupuncture, for example, were suspect until they had been used for quite literally hundreds or even thousands of years. So the orientation in Chinese medicine historically is towards the old. And our orientation in the West is towards the new. And so what the balance is valuing both, is valuing innovation as well as what is traditional and indigenous and old. And we're really very far away from that. So I think one way to reorient towards that is, in our culture now, is really to start to value what is old and traditional and indigenous. So do we support new or old medical technology? I think that's the same story. Do we support new or old remedies? Speaking to the coronavirus in particular, there are old remedies that are quite literally hundreds and thousands of years old, literally, that could potentially effectively treat the coronavirus. We're getting reports from China, from the Wuhan hospital, from physicians who treated there. And in the Wuhan hospital, many people, if not most people, were treated with acupuncture and herbs. They were not treated with Western biomedicine. And the success rates were very high. And so we're not talking about treating just colds and flus. I mean, we're talking about respiratory failure, severe pneumonia, psychoses coming from the condition. So Chinese medicine does have the potential to help with those kinds of things. And the value of that is those remedies have been used continuously for generation after generation after generation. So there's a tremendous amount of empirical data that indicates their effectiveness. So this speaks to our orientation towards the yang. So let's look at things academically. Do we value new research or old research? New books or old books, new ideas or old ideas? Now, I'm not anti-new books. I wrote a book a few years ago, so I'm not against new books or new ideas. But we're led to believe that if something is new, sometimes just that alone makes it better than something that is old. And that is not the orientation historically of China and of Chinese medicine. So we need to be discerning. We need to, I believe, not only in our own lives, but medically, culturally, ecologically, we need to be discerning about what new things are appropriate, what new things are going to promote health and well-being and sustainability. So as I see it, this is the same story. It's the same story continuing. It speaks again to our orientation towards the yang. Let's make it personal. Who wants old cell phones? Who wants old laptops? Now here in Vermont, we're kind of ahead of the curve in many ways. We really do value the old. Lots of people value old agricultural practices, old trucks, old simpler ways of living, which is one of the many reasons why I love Vermont. But the general story in our culture is not to value the old. We assume a new cell phone is better than an old cell phone. A new laptop is better than the old laptop. New music is better than old music. In Vermont, we really do value older music, jazz and classical and bluegrass, and do other parts of the country as well. A new car isn't necessarily better than an old car. A new technology isn't necessarily better than an old technology. And the last one is really important too. Is it better to be busy and productive or not? An assumption in our culture is that doing is better than not doing. And there's lots of things to do. There's lots of people to treat in our clinic. There's lots of interesting ideas to explore academically. There's lots of work towards sustainability and personal health. All of that is important. But doing is not necessarily better than not doing. It has to be balanced. So we're going to talk about this shortly. The idea that self-care in our era of climate crisis has to be specific. Not all self-care is going to be appropriate. So what we're going to talk about next is the idea of yin self-care, the self-care of less, the self-care of relaxation, the self-care of taking it easy, the self-care of contentment. It's because what we have really culturally is we not only have, but we're led to believe that it's good and appropriate to have a lack of contentment. And that leads to things like materialism and not being satisfied with what we already have. So again, this, as I see it, speaks to the same story, which is our orientation towards yang. And there it is, economically, medically, personally, and academically. The pattern is the same pattern. Chinese medicine is really good at this. It can take things like our views of economics and our personal views and academic views and medical views, and we can see the patterns. We can see how it's really the same story that's playing out over and over again. So what do we do about this? What do we do about when not only ecologically, but culturally, when the yin has gone down and the yang has gone up? And what does that mean for self-care? What does that mean personally in our own immediate lives in terms of what we can do? What it means is we are in urgent need of balance. We're in need of balance individually, culturally, and ecologically. And that simple word, and unfortunately, is not spoken about very much. It's not spoken about ecologically or on a personal scale in terms of human health. Because self-care now has to be specific within the context of what's going on around us. And so what that means is with the situation that we're in, where the yang is up and the yin is down, we need to revalue the yin. We need to revalue the old. We need to revalue the traditional and the indigenous. We need to value rest. We need to value doing less things and being more satisfied and content in our lives. Because we have a lot of problems, and one of the problems we have is an epidemic of busyness. There's nothing wrong with being busy. I value being busy. I value the work that we do here at our clinic and speaking and teaching. I value the discussion we're having tonight. But doing is not necessarily better than non-doing. It always is a question of balance. We need balance ecologically, personally, and culturally. So what is that balance like? It's not just balance in general. We need to differentiate. We need to use a differential diagnosis to understand what's going on. So we need more yin. We need more coolant. We need more rest. We need more contraction. We need more old, and we need less, right? So one of the very best things that we could do for most of us, and now everyone is different based on age and activity levels and all that, all the unique things that make us the unique individuals that we are. But one of the very best remedies that we could do, that we can employ now, is rest and relaxation. So let's take it to the level of an epidemic or a pandemic. You know, some of us are self-quarantining. Some of us are being asked or strongly requested to self-quarantine. Well, quarantine can sound so negative. What if what that's about is yin? What if we're doing now is a staycation? Rather than flying off or driving off to some exotic place, maybe we can just stay home. So what is staying home? Staying home is yin. So one of the very best remedies, not only for our own well-being, but for addressing an epidemic and a pandemic, and in healing the planet, is to be satisfied with less. One of the best things we could do right now is sleep 9 to 12 hours a night, unplug from social media and the internet after this talk, of course, and take it easy. And that's of vital importance, because sometimes the simplest remedy, the easiest remedy, the least expensive remedy, the most accessible remedy is the most important one. So sleep is a wonderful remedy for the excess heat that we have individually and collectively. We need to slow down. We need to do less. So an assumption in Chinese medicine, in Western medicine, generally speaking, and of course there are exceptions, but generally speaking, the assumption is, I don't feel well. I want to take care of myself. What am I going to do? Well, there's probably many things you could do, but one of the very best things most of us could do would be to do less, would be to take it easy, would be to sleep more, would be to hang out more. Hang out with yourself, hang out with your family, hang out with your friends, hang out with your immediate community. Doing less is of vital importance now, because doing less cultivates yin. It cultivates peace, it cultivates relaxation, it cultivates quiet, it cultivates contentment. So with more yin, there will necessarily be less yang. Less warmth, less activity, less expansion, less new things, and having less. So it's only in a culture that is oriented towards yang that having less is inherently a bad idea. And again, there's lots of people who need more in Vermont, around the country, and around the world. There's people who need more healthcare, more places to live, more education, more debt relief, more love, more compassion. There's no doubt that there's lots of more that we need. But systemically, what we need is less. We need less activity, less materialism, less dissatisfaction. Because when the yang goes up and the yin goes down internally, what we have is less peace and contentment. So cultivating contentment internally is a wonderful remedy for ecological, personal, and cultural imbalance. So we really need to orient, I believe, reorient towards balance. We need to increase yin and decrease yang. Another way of describing that is we need to increase the quality of our lives and decrease the quantity of things that we have. We're led to believe one of our cultural stories is if we have more stuff, we'll be happier and healthier. And it's just not true. After a certain point, once we have the things that we need for ourselves, our family, our communities, having more stuff can do the opposite. And that's not only a Chinese medical view, there's lots of Western psychological research that indicates that as well. But what can drive the desire to keep doing and more is a lack of yin, is a lack of contentment, and is a lack of satisfaction. So in focusing on the quality of our lives, the quality of our experiences, the quality of our relationships with ourselves, with other people, with nature, focusing on the quality of things and really realizing that at some point the quantity of things doesn't really matter. It's not satisfying, and it's also in many cases not sustainable. So a couple of other quick things. Water is good too. Water is cooling, water is yin. So I'm teaching a class next month at Rail Yard Apothecary here in Burlington. As far as I know, that class is still happening. And if it doesn't happen in person, maybe it can happen online. It's a day-long class. It's going to take a lot of the ideas we discussed today and apply it towards diet and lifestyle and Western herbs. And if you're not in the area, I'm teaching a class online, free talk actually in April, and a 4-part online class in the evenings, East Coast time, on understanding and treating Lyme. And a preview of that is Lyme is a hot condition. So the way we can understand and treat Lyme from a Chinese medical view is to, exactly as we've been talking about, we can decrease the heat and increase the coolant. So if any of you are interested in that, that class is sponsored by the American Herbalist Guild, which is a wonderful national, international herb group. And that's